Good morning, this is Dr. Nicola Duchamp. This morning I'm going to talk to you a few minutes about methylation and why methylation support can be a good thing, but too much methylation support is then going to become a bad thing. So what are we talking about when we talk about methylation? I feel like it's been not popularized, just people are more aware of it in the last few years. So methylation really comes down to a series of biochemical pathways in the body. And the bottom line, if I try to make this as simple as possible, is that folic acid is not getting converted to folate and methylfolate, and that is slowing down other reactions in the body. Okay, so people who have certain mutations on certain genes are said to have methylation defects. And it's thought that up to 50% of the population has these genetic mutations. And those mutations then influence the methylation pathways and how they function. So it's kind of like, you know, when you have a recipe and you're trying to bake this amazing cake and you're missing an ingredient, or you have like corn flour instead of almond flour, or whatever the case may be, if you don't have the right mix and the right ingredients and the right proportions, that baked good is not going to come out the way you intended. And so it is with our biochemistry. If we have a break in the pathway or a slowdown in the pathways at some point, then the whole pathway is not going to run smoothly. Okay, so to assess for methylation issues, I mean, there's a couple of basic ways to do it, and then there's more advanced, kind of more in detail ways. Bottom line is that there's two main genes that are associated with MTHFR, the A1298C and the 677T. And those things can be tested by regular labs like LabCorp or Quest. Those two are not hard to find in terms of testing. Now, mutations can either be heterozygous or homozygous. So you realize that every gene, we have two copies. One comes from mom and one comes from dad. So some people are going to be heterozygous, meaning one copy of the gene is mutated, and some people are going to be homozygous, which means both copies of the gene is mutated. And obviously, if you have both copies of both genes mutated, you're going to be in worse shape potentially than having one copy of one gene. So with that, there are a couple of other things that we can look for on lab work, like elevated homocysteine, for example, is common when there's methylation issues. And the problem with that is if homocysteine is not being converted to methionine, which is kind of where the breakdown happens there, that's why homocysteine can build up, because it's not able to move through its pathway, its biochemical pathway. So we see elevated homocysteine on lab work. But the problem with that is methionine is needed to create other proteins in the body. Okay, so the whole pathway is quite complicated when you look at it, and it can feel really overwhelming. But the bottom line is this: people who aren't methylating correctly because of these gene mutations need methylation support. Okay, we can provide what's called methyl groups to help that pathway move through. Now, there's a couple of different ways to do this. One, and the most basic, simple way, is to give a supplement of methylfolate. Because remember I said at the beginning, that's the down and dirty bottom line. There's a lot of other steps and a lot of other substances and substrates along the way that are impacted. But the key, the bottom line, is to get methylated folate, or 5-methylhydrotetrafolate, into the pathway so it can help move that pathway on. It's basically saying, okay, we see you're a little broken here. We're just going to give you a little bit of help and feed some of that methylfolate into the pathway so that the wheels can keep turning. So my favorite way to do that, and this is where I start with more sensitive individuals, is a supplement called Folapro. It's by Metagenics. It's tablets. It's really inexpensive. It's the 5-methylfolate, and even really sensitive people could start with a half a tablet or a quarter of a tablet and kind of work up from there. Another one I really like is by Thorne, and it's either MethylGuard or MethylGuard Plus. So the difference is in the dosing. MethylGuard is a little bit more, little lower doses. MethylGuard Plus is a little higher doses. And that contains a few different methyl donors. So it has methylfolate, methyl B12 or methylated vitamin B12. It has dimethylglycine, which is another methyl donor. So when we give these nutrients, it's not so much about the nutrient itself, it's really about the methyl group that's attached to it. And that's why when people do B12 injections or take a B12 supplement, it's important to be aware of your methylation situation so that you know what kind of B12 you need. Now, there are some people out there who are over methylators, and so methyl B12 is horrible for them. Okay, so they do better with either a hydroxy B12 or adenosine B12. There's another B12 called cyanocobalamin, but that's really the cheap kind of nasty synthetic stuff. Adenosine or hydroxy are better ways to go if you need B12 and don't need the methylation support. But a lot of people do well with methyl B12. And I mean, I have seen kids on the autism spectrum change dramatically in a week by supporting their methylation. I mean, I've seen kids go from nonverbal to verbal in 3 days. I'm not kidding you. So this methylation support is important. And then, dietary things, for example, dairy can block the folate receptors. So people with methylation issues are advised to not eat dairy. So there are some things that can help. Eat a diet very rich in green leafy vegetables and things like that that are really nutrient dense will help provide more of those vitamins and minerals to support the pathway. So I talked about the Folapro, I talked about MethylGuard and MethylGuard Plus. The other thing that can be helpful is SAMe. Now, SAMe, I think of SAMe when we know there's methylation issues, but there's also mood instability, whether it's anxiety or depression or whatever the case may be. SAMe, because it supports serotonin production as well, can be a good choice in that situation, in that context. And so that's another thing to consider. So that's kind of the basics of what sort of how I look at methylation. Now, there are some doctors and some naturopaths who are really into all these genetic markers and the genetic SNPs. And so I know, 23andMe made this very popular to get your genes looked at and look at all your SNPs and see where you've got things gone wrong. Well, 23andMe is not necessarily the company I would stand behind anymore because I think there were some privacy issues with it. But there are other companies that have, gene panels that provide information about the basic methylation stuff, but so much more as well. And I mean, to be quite honest with you, I'm not well versed and not highly experienced in looking at all of the ins and outs of all the genetic stuff. I usually refer out for that if need be. But it can be really interesting to see. And I think one point that's interesting and important to make is just because mutations are present doesn't mean you're stuck being affected by them. And this is this whole realm of epigenetics and nutrigenomics, and it's like beyond the genes, right? So there are ways to influence how our genes are expressed. And there's things like NRF2 activation that can actually help the methylation issues on a gene level. So that's sort of a whole fascinating kind of part of it. But just, today I'm just really trying to help you understand the basics of methylation. Now, if you have MTHFR problems, if you will, what could that mean for you? Well, it could mean a whole lot of different things. I mean, certainly it can put people at higher cardiovascular risk, which is part of why we screen for that elevated homocysteine level. But methylation's been associated with all kinds of different things. I mean, chronic pain, autism spectrum, neurological issues, certainly mood issues, anxiety, depression, things like that. And so there's a lot of different elements here that may be impacted. Methylation is also associated with detoxification. So that's one of the key things, that people with methylation defects can't detoxify properly and may have a harder time getting through treatment for other, chronic health issues. And so, that's something that it behooves one to take care of that. And it's fairly straightforward to do. But the final point I want to make is just be aware. It's better to start slow with methylation support because, as you turn those pathways on, as you help support the wheels going around, things can change. So the first thing is that detox pathways can start working better, which is great. But then you may also start dumping more toxins. And that doesn't always feel good. So just being aware of that. The other thing is that some people are more sensitive than others, and too much methylation support is going to create the same kind of problems that just enough methylation support solves. Does that make sense? So if you have severe anxiety, you have chronic fatigue, and you start over supporting methylation, it could push you back into fatigue. It could push you back into anxiety. It could, resurface pain that you were able to circumvent with smaller doses. So it's really important that we kind of take this on a moderate path and don't just run out and start taking, full dose of Methyl Guard Plus, especially if you're really sensitive and you have some issues with detox. Because over-methylation could cause symptoms just like under-methylation can. So as always, I think it's always a good idea just to sort of start on the more gentle side, start on the lower dose, and just kind of gradually work your way up and see how you feel. Chances are you'll feel it. If you get to a good dose, you should feel better. If you get to a too high dose, you're going to start feeling worse again. And I've seen that in some of my patients that were put on really high dose methylation support, and they were wondering why they weren't feeling good, and it just was too much for them. So that's what I wanted to share with you today. And I hope that was valuable for you. Reach out if you have any questions. And if you have any other topics that you would like to hear about, please shoot me a message. I'm always open to that. And otherwise, have a really wonderful day.